Every time someone talks about Ray Allen nowadays, they always love to mention the fact that before he got to Boston, he was more than a shooter. He could get to the basket and was more of an overall complete scorer. But what no one seems to mention though is that Ray was a leader of two great forgotten teams, the 2001 Milwaukee Bucks and the 2005 Seattle Supersonics. We'll be talking about the latter today. It was the last good season for a storied franchise, which was not only forgotten but plagued by injuries and their eventual playoff loss. The Sonics were coming off a disappointing year in 04, where they finished with a 37-45 record. And to begin the 05 season, many thought Seattle would struggle to reach 30 wins, and trading Ray Allen to a contender before his contract expired seemed like the most reasonable play to make. Many of the players, as well as the coach, were free agents. So for the Seattle faithful, it seemed like time to wait around for the lottery. All of a sudden, they were the surprise of the season, starting with a 17-3 record, led by the original Splash Brothers in Rashard Lewis and Ray Allen, who would both go on to make the All-Star team, averaging 13 three-point attempts per game between the two of them, which was absolutely unheard of back then. Apart from the revolutionary Phoenix Suns under Mike D'Antoni, the 05 Sonics were shooting more threes than any other team that season, finishing with the second best offensive rating, also behind the legendary Nash-led offense. Besides being a forgotten team, this Seattle squad was really ahead of their time offensively. Outside of the original Splash Bros, the team really had a spark off the bench, with two guys who finished in the top 10 in Sixth Man of the Year voting. The first one was Vladimir Radmanovic, a stretch four who could provide scoring off the bench and was a great fit with their style of play. They also had Antonio Daniels off the bench, who is mostly known for getting crossed over by Allen Iverson, but he was a good point guard with serious hops that could attack the paint, run the floor, and was a pretty decent defender on a team that needed more defense desperately. Davis also played the best playoff series of his career this year, which we'll get into later. Joining Allen and Lewis in the starting lineup was Luke Ridnour at point guard. He was the definition of a solid 2000s point guard. He could shoot and play make to a decent level, averaging 10 and 6 for the year. Alongside them was Reggie Evans, a tough power forward and a great rebounder. Finally, Jerome James was the center. This was the only year in his career where he was a full-time starter. Definitely the weakest link in the Seattle squad with averages of 3 points and 5 rebounds. Despite the amazing start, the Sonics flew under the radar with the media. They wrote them off and everyone thought they would fall off by December. Besides, there were plenty of storylines that overshadowed this team back in 2004. First, Shaq had left Kobe and the Lakers to join forces with D-Wade in Miami. LeBron was taking off as an MVP candidate, the Suns were playing the most fun brand of basketball ever seen, and the Malice at the Palace had happened to begin that season. The Sonics shot nearly as many three-pointers as the Suns, but they weren't mainstream like Phoenix was. They didn't run the fast break or pick and roll like they did. Don't get it twisted, Seattle was a slow-paced, scrappy rebounding team who happened to have shooters on their roster. The Sonics would go through ups and downs throughout the year after their amazing start. Some cold shooting nights and an injury to Rashard Lewis would keep them from continuing the pace that they had started the season with. But they would still win their division with a 52-30 record, finishing as the third seed in the West and matching up with the 50-win Sacramento Kings. The Kings still had most of their core from the legendary 2002 squad, only replacing an aging Vlade Divac with Brad Miller. However, Chris Webber hadn't been the same after blowing out his knee against the Mavs in the 2003 playoffs, which is an underrated what-if actually. I think that Sacramento team really had a shot to win it all that year. Regardless, midway through the 05 season, the front office traded Chris Webber to the Sixers, which turned out to be a lose-lose trade for both teams. Still, many saw Sacramento as the favorite in their first-round matchup. In Game 1, the always inconsistent Jerome James would have 17 points, 15 rebounds, and 5 blocks, alongside Ray's 28, leading Seattle to an 87-82 win. The Sonics blew a 21-point second-half lead, but held on with big baskets by Allen and James. At the time, the feeling going into Game 2 was that Seattle had let Sacramento off the hook after blowing a massive lead in Game 1. However, Game 2 featured the same dynamic duo as Game 1 did. Ray continued shooting well as he had 26 points and many big shots, and Jerome James continued to look like prime David Robinson for whatever reason, with 19 and 9 on 9 of 11 shooting. The Kings would go on to take Game 3 back at home with a big game from the forever underrated Mike Bibby. Kobe and Shaq would continue producing, but Rashard Lewis had not been able to assert himself in this series. In a pivotal Game 4, Ray would have 45 points to silence all the critics who didn't want the Sonics to pay him like a superstar. Seattle would then go on to win Game 5 and close out the series. Besides Ray Allen's fantastic series, the biggest storyline was Jerome James's play. A center who had averaged 5 points and 3 rebounds during the regular season averaged 17, 9, and 2 blocks. After the Game 5 victory, we found out that this was a revenge series for Jerome. He wore a trash bag during his post-game interviews because Rick Adelman apparently handed him one to clean out his locker before waiving him 5 years earlier. Seattle was ecstatic over the series win, but they had to face the San Antonio Spurs in the second round. Greg Popovich's team was obviously the favorite, but 4 lights-out shooting nights for the Sonics and more of this inexplicable level of play from Jerome James wasn't impossible at all. But bad luck would strike Seattle in Game 1, as both Radmanovic and Ray Allen had to be taken out after spraining their ankle. The Spurs obviously won that game. Ray would be able to come back, but Radmanovic did not play again in this series. I know this doesn't sound like a huge factor, but having a stretch 4 in 2005 was not the norm. And for the minutes that Duncan was playing at power forward, he would have had to stay out of the paint more than he wanted to. San Antonio continued to seize home court advantage, taking Game 2 in another blowout. Things seemed bleak for the Sonics, but at least Rashard Lewis was playing like himself after a disappointing first round. Game 3 turned out to be the complete opposite of Seattle's season. In a must-win game, they actually got crucial stops down the stretch, which were also helped by the Spurs' struggles from the line. But the Sonics also went 2 of 16 from 3 and still won. Jerome James also reappeared after coming back to earth in the first 2 games. Nick Collison had an impact and Antonio Daniels was huge, pouring in 10 of the 17 fourth quarter points for the team. In another must-win in Game 4, Rashard Lewis would be unable to play due to a sprained toe. So now, the Sonics were without their second and third leading scorer attempting to tie the series against Goliath. After what seemed like a fluky win in Game 3, Seattle comfortably won Game 4, led by Ray's 32 points, who remember sprained his ankle in Game 1. With Rashard Lewis out, Antonio Daniels moved into the starting lineup and had another fantastic game against his former team. Sonics fans had been debating between Ridnour and Daniels for the starting point guard spot, but now they excelled playing together in a convincing victory to tie up the series. Then, in the always pivotal Game 5, Ginobili would lead the Spurs to victory with a 39-point masterpiece. And good games from Seattle's role players were not enough to offset a mediocre shooting night for Ray and the absence of Rashard Lewis and Radmanovic. But was the series over? These Sonics had taught us to expect the unexpected. Prior to the season, no one expected Seattle to keep Ray Allen and make the playoffs. After the hot start, everyone thought they would cool off before the All-Star break. Then, everyone expected the veteran Kings to beat them in the first round. Now, as an underdog, once again, they were facing elimination against the unstoppable machine that are the Spurs, without 2 of their 3 leading scorers. Could they pull off yet another miracle? It sure looked possible coming into the fourth quarter of Game 6, as the Sonics were up 1 point and Key Arena was electric. Ray Allen and Antonio Daniels were leading the charge against the Spurs defense, and Tim Duncan was having a horrendous shooting night from the floor, going 2 of 13 coming into the last period. With 8:05 remaining, Duncan crashed into Nick Collison on a drive and hurt his left foot. Everything was pointing to a Game 7, but Timmy D would have a legendary fourth quarter, scoring 12 points on a bad foot after struggling for the entire game. Still, the scrappy Sonics kept battling, and after Antonio Daniels split a pair of free throws, the Spurs could wait for the final shot, tied at 96. Ginobili, who had been fantastic in this series, was a leading ball handler for the Spurs, and he would hold on for the final shot, with Key Arena holding their breath. And then, Duncan would show why he's a top 10 player to ever play the game. Ray Allen would get surprisingly close to extending the series to 7 with a wild attempt. But it was over. The last great season in Seattle had come to an end. Nate McMillan would leave for Portland and the Sonics would lose Daniels and James in free agency. They were unable to replicate their success in the coming years, and by 2007, most of the team's core was gone, and now it was time to build around KD, which only lasted for a season before the team got moved to Oklahoma. I'm sure this is bittersweet for Sonics fans. It was a remarkable season that surprised everyone. Ray Allen went toe-to-toe with the eventual champs without his co-star, but it was also the beginning of the end in many ways. What no one knew at the time though was that the series win against the Kings would be the last ever in franchise history, and that nail-biting Game 6 against the Spurs in Key Arena would be the last playoff game in Seattle. Nevertheless, never forget the OG Splash Bros who went head-to-head with the Spurs dynasty.